Good morning. Good morning to those in the auditorium, and good morning to those that are visiting with us by way of live streaming. We are starting a study of the Book of Lamentations. So if you would turn to the Book of Lamentations, we'll get started here if I can get my equipment situated correctly. Sorry about the delay. I was talking to a person this morning, said they were going to tune in to the Bible class by way of live streaming, and remarked that it better be good. If they were going to tune in, it needed to be good. So the pressure's on to have a good Bible class this morning. A study of Lamentations might well begin in the 28th chapter of the Book of Deuteronomy, in the 15th verse. In that section of Scripture, in Deuteronomy 15, or Deuteronomy 28:15, the children of Israel were warned. So as we begin the class there with Deuteronomy 28:15, let's bow for a moment of prayer. Father in heaven, we're so grateful unto Thee for the blessings that we enjoy, for the opportunity for meeting here for Bible class and for worship. Bless us this day in our class and in our worship. And help us to leave with the motivation of doing good all the days of our lives. In Jesus' name. The Jews were instructed to, according to the law of Moses, to have their children understand the law of Moses. They were instructed to, on a daily basis, teach the children about the law. And so, in the days of Jeremiah, if in fact they didn't know the law and disobeyed the law because they didn't know it, they were in a world of hurt. If they just ignored the law, then same thing. They knew the law and just disregarded it. The consequences were the same. But in the 28th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy, beginning with the 15th verse, "But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee." And then he begins to list those curses. "Cursed shalt thou be in the city, and cursed shalt thou be in the field. Cursed shalt thou be in the basket, thy basket, and thy store," that is, their provisions. "Cursed shalt thou be in the fruit of thy body, and the fruit of thy land, and the increase of thy cattle, and the flocks of thy sheep. Cursed shalt thou be when thou comest in, and cursed shalt thou be when thou goest out." Now, during the various judges, where there was a cycle of good and evil, and then repentance and coming back to God, and all through the history of the Jews, they oftentimes ignored the law of Moses. Oftentimes they just purposefully were evil, and God nurtured them and brought them back through his prophets. But then, during the Babylonian era, God had enough, and he, in fact, destroyed the city of Jerusalem, the temple, and all that was therein. And we've studied about that, of course. And now we come to the Book of Lamentations, where Jeremiah, and it's universally agreed, I think, among Bible scholars and individuals, that Lamentations was a product of Jeremiah. Lamentations is an interesting book from several standpoints. Um, the arrangement of the book is quite interesting. In chapters 1, 2, and 4, each of those chapters have 22 verses. It's my understanding that the Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters, and each of the verses in those 22 chapters, or in those 22 verses of chapters 1, 2, and 4, begin with a consecutive letter of the alphabet. Now, chapter 3 has 66 verses, and so each three segments of 3 verses begins with a letter of the Jewish alphabet in succession. Then in chapter 5, there's 22 verses, and each of the verses begins with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet, but not in consecutive order, not in the ABC order. Now that's kind of the arrangement. This was a poem. For whatever reason, that the average person wouldn't think of putting a narrative into a poem, or maybe some of people that would do that. But in this case, it was kind of a poem. Each of the 5 chapters have kind of a theme. The first theme is in chapter 1 is the suffering of Jerusalem. Now we can't imagine living in this era in a country where, generally speaking, there's protection. We have civil rights. We have constitutional rights. We just, by the Constitution, we have rights. And our founding documents talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We have, the 10 Amendments of the Constitution, which give us personal rights. And so we can imagine a situation where we would be under, constant attack, under constant persecution from within the country, and then, basically, except the fighting among people in the country and the Civil War and so forth, our land has been relatively free of battle from foreign entities, relatively speaking. So, and we couldn't imagine, at least I can't imagine, Washington, D.C., the seat of government, or any state capital, whether it be Ohio or whatever state. We just can't imagine those symbols, those facilities that represent our government. We just can't imagine those being reduced to rubble. At least I can't imagine it. And so, but if that would be the case, wouldn't there be just terrible mourning and mental anguish and emotional disturbance within individuals? But Jeremiah had witnessed. Now I don't know how Jeremiah was protected from the onslaught of the Babylonian armies. God protected him providentially, maybe even miraculously. But he was an eyewitness to all of this destruction. Now, people that are eyewitnesses to various events that are unusual will sometimes put something down as a narrative. They'll write it down. People that go through a lot of trauma oftentimes record that trauma and make it available to other people. But when Jeremiah wrote this, I wonder if he was writing it while the Babylonians were coming in, while he was just firsthand witnessing, jotting notes down, or whether it was after the battle and the Babylonians moved on and people were captured and taken away, others were killed, or whether it was when he, eventually Jeremiah, as we know, was probably forced to go into Egypt with a group of people that under the leadership of a rebel. But when he wrote this, I don't think there's anyone really knows, but he gives a real graphic narration about the destruction of Jerusalem, which is in chapter 1. And then he talks about, in chapter 2, he talks about the suffering of the sanctuary, that is the temple. Temple had been in existence for almost 4 centuries. And it was the temple was kind of a symbol of God's protection. The Jews believed that, as long as we have a temple here, and God wouldn't destroy his temple, or wouldn't allow his temple to be destroyed, they had that mindset. But when the temple was destroyed, that was a big event in the life of the Hebrew nation, and that's chapter 2, the destruction of the temple, and how the heathen entered in the temple, which wasn't allowed under the Mosaic law. Not only were they ransacked it, they tore it completely down. Then in chapter 3, Jeremiah turns to himself and describes his suffering, and obviously he's known broadly as the weeping prophet, and we can understand why he would be known as a weeping prophet, because of his great anguish with regard to the destruction of Jerusalem, and particularly the temple. Then in chapter 4 was just a general suffering of the siege. When the Babylonian army came in, the Babylonians had surrounded that city, shut off the supply chain, shut off traffic in and out for maybe 18 months. And you can imagine, you can imagine if the stores in Columbus shut down for 18 months. I mean, what would be happening in the typical home? And I suppose people would be offering a Mercedes-Benz automobile for a loaf of bread, or some such transaction. And that was Jeremiah's describing that sort of scenario in this siege. And then the last chapter has to do with Judah's penitent plea. It's amazing. At least some of the Jews, well, maybe I shouldn't say that it's amazing, but at least some of these Jews were of the mindset that, we brought this on ourselves. We were guilty, and God has punished us. Now, I'm sure not all of them, but at least some of them had that mindset. And so, as we study Lamentations, we'll be looking first at the destruction and suffering in Jerusalem, the temple, the suffering of Jeremiah, suffering during the siege, and then Judah's penitent plea to God in the last chapter of Lamentations. He says in verse 1, "How doth the city sit solitary, that was full of people? How has she become a widow?" She that was great among the nations and princes among the provinces, how has she become tributary? It was kind of eerie for me to go downtown at a certain period of time in our pandemic, and the streets were empty. And that gives you an eerie feeling. The streets are empty. But you can imagine Jeremiah's thoughts when the streets of Jerusalem were empty except for the dead bodies and for the houses that were torn down and the walls that were torn down and the temple that was torn down. And he personifies this by saying, how is she become a widow? I wonder why he would use that personification there. A widow. What was the condition of the widows in that era, particularly when Jews were not in accord with the law of Moses? Widows were in a world of hurt. I don't think we can, and of course in some places in the world, India might be one where we collect money for goats for widows when Jim Waldron makes a plea for goats for widows as a means of livelihood. But I don't think we can, at least I can't internalize what a widow's plight would be without Social Security, without pensions, without family. But in that era, the plight of a widow was destitute. It was just a whirl of hurt day after day. And so he likens Jerusalem, he personifies here, likens Jerusalem to a widow. That which was great, and then she says, she, that which was great among the nations. Think of Solomon's reign in Israel, where people from all over the globe, the known globe, where they came to seek the wisdom and the wonder of that empire, that nation. They, and no doubt, Jeremiah knew of that grandeur of that nation. He knew of how other nations maybe didn't have total respect for Jerusalem, but at least had some regard for it being a powerful civil, a powerful body politic in the world community. He said it was great among and the princes among the provinces. How has she become a tributary? What's a tributary? Lack of sovereignty. It had no sovereignty. It's ruled by another people. And of course, what was left of Jerusalem was ruled by, in the Judean area, was ruled by the Babylonian Empire. Then he says, she weepeth sore in the night. Again, this personification here as a widow. She weepeth sore in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers she hath none to comfort her, and all her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They are become her enemies. As we've studied over the past months, Jerusalem, the kings of Judah, were always trying to align with the various nations around about as for protection. They had alliances. God, through his prophets, said, you need to depend on me, God, as opposed to, the alliances with Egypt and Moab and Edom and so on. But these people weren't, and now that Jerusalem was reduced to rubble, these friends were gone. They not only weren't remembering any alliances with them, they had become their enemies. When you'll recall in your study of Ezra and Nehemiah, when after 70 years of captivity, when these pilgrimages come back to Jerusalem, you remember what happened with regard to the people around about. They fought the Jews in rebuilding the wall. They were no, even 70 years later, those nations were not in league or friendly to Jerusalem, to the Judean area, to Judah. It says we've got not only are we reduced to rubble, nobody's sympathetic to us, and most of them are glad we got reduced to rubble. Verse 3, Judah has gone into captivity because of affliction and because of great servitude. So did they get into captivity to live the good life? Apparently not. They were in captivity, in affliction, in great servitude. She dwelleth among the nations, so they were scattered among the nations. The Jews were scattered among the nations. Remember when the Persians took over at the time of Esther, in the 127 provinces, where the Jews were scattered among all those provinces. So they were scattered among the heathen. Now, at the time of Esther, what did the heathen want to do to the Jews? Wipe them out. Get rid of them. She findeth no rest. Wouldn't that be? Wouldn't that be something? Have no rest, day or night. After a full day's shoveling snow or whatever people do, unless they hire somebody to do their stuff, pretty good to just sit down in the evening and rest and look forward to going to bed, I guess. Findeth no rest. All her persecutors overtook her between the straits. Now, what happened to King Zedekiah when he snuck out of Jerusalem? Well, the Babylonians went after him, captured him, killed his sons in front of him, put his eyes out, and then took him off into captivity. So, Jeremiah kind of brings together all of that which we've kind of studied over the time we've been in Jeremiah. Brings together all of that that persecution, the narratives. So the persecutors overtook them, even those that tried to escape. They including the king, got overtaken. Verse 4, the ways of Zion do mourn, because none came to solemn feast. I don't know. During this pandemic, the usual festivals, the county fairs and the state fairs. Why do people go to festivals and the county fair and the state fairs and those kind of things? Why do people go there? Maybe some people don't. But why do most people want to go to those kind of things? I can't hear through the mask, but I think humans are social beings, and we deal with people, and it's but at least I kind of missed going to the state fair. I missed having the booth at the state fair, this past year. We missed camp. What else do we miss? Missed a lot of things. That gets to you after a while. At least it's not so much as a person of faith. As persons of faith, it doesn't maybe get to us, but that gets to the average person. They're not having that interaction. Why is the suicide rate going up, particularly among the young people? So you get a kind of a picture of how bad this was. The ways of Zion do mourn because none come to the solemn feasts. The feasts were shut down. The various feasts were shut down. Her gates are desolate. Now, where did in the average Jewish community, where was business transacted? The gates of the city. We read about that in Ruth, where Boaz went to the gates to make a deal with regard to Ruth. So business transactions. Sometimes I'd like to have less business transactions, but there's some feeling of I guess worth in business transactions, and the business transactions were shut down. And her priest sign, the religious leaders are in sighing. That is, they're just, and of course, most of them have been killed. Her virgins are afflicted. They're in the context of religious activities. They had female attendants at the temple, and she is in bitterness. So there was just instead of I suppose there was a festive for the Passover feast. Don't you suppose there was kind of a festive environment there with people, relatives meeting there, friends meeting? But all this is gone. This is over. And he's remembering, the good old days. They're gone. And for them in their lifetime, never would they have these. Now there were a few people that got back from Babylon that went back to Jerusalem. They remembered the original temple, or the Solomon temple. But for most people, those days are gone. Her adversaries are the chief. And what's that mean? Heathens were running Jerusalem. Heathens were running that area of the world. Adversaries of Judah. Her adversaries are chief. They're in charge. Her enemies prosper. For the Lord hath afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions. Her children are gone into captivity before the enemy. Of course, this recurring theme is because of your transgressions. because of their transgressions. In verse 6, and from the daughter of Zion, all her beauty is departed. Personifying here Jerusalem, once a thriving city with commerce and religious activities, and in many respects the good life. Her beauty is departed. All those things are departed. Her princes are become like deer that had no pasture, and they are gone without strength before the pursuer. Likening Jerusalem to the wild beasts that have no pasture, or apple trees where they can deer pick off apples, and they pick off a lot of things, and soybeans and corn and so on. But there's none of that. I mean, they're gone without strength before the pursuer. So Jerusalem is likened unto those things that we, know about. Verse 7, Jerusalem remembered in the days of her affliction and her miseries and all her pleasant things that she had in the days of old, when her people fell into the land, or into the hand of the enemy, and none did help her. The adversaries saw her and did mock at her Sabbaths. Now notice that, mock at her Sabbaths. You Jews, some of you, you obeyed the Sabbath law, the law of Moses. And the Sabbath here was kind of a substitute word for the, your law of Moses, your religion. Your religion. People often mock at religion, right? Often mock at the Christian community. Well, it says here that, and they did none did help her. Nobody came to the rescue of Jerusalem. The adversaries saw her and did mock at her religion, or her Sabbaths. And now he comes back to this theme. Jerusalem hath grievously sinned. Therefore she's removed. All that honoreth her despise her, because they have seen her nakedness. Yea, she signeth and turneth backwards. That idea of seeing her nakedness has, the idea here is that all their sins, their secret sins or whatever, have been exposed. And somehow the world knew that Israel's destruction, particularly Judah's destruction, was related to God through his providence and his purpose doing so. They mocked them. Her filthiness is in her skirts. Graphic description there. She remembereth not her last end. She doesn't think about, that is Jerusalem, didn't think about the consequences of the sin. They didn't remember the last end. What was the last end? What did the law of Moses say the last end of evil was? Punishment. Therefore she came down wonderfully. What's that? That we don't use the word wonderfully in the same sense it was used here. What does that wonderfully mean there? She came down wonderfully. It was amazingly. It was graphically. It was with a bang, so to speak. She had no comforter. Nobody was sympathetic to the fall of Jerusalem. Oh Lord, you can just imagine Jeremiah just in deep distress saying, "Oh Lord, behold my affliction." God, look at my affliction here. For the enemy hath magnified himself. The adversary has spread over his hand upon all her pleasant things. What were her pleasant things? Material things, necessities of life. But more so, for she hath seen that the heathen, personifying Jerusalem here, the heathen entered the temple into her sanctuary, into the very place where the priest was allowed, the high priest was allowed only once a year. But the heathen just ransacked the sanctuary, whom thou didst command that they should not enter into thy congregation. Edomites weren't allowed in the congregation for how many generations? 10 generations. Okay? Which identified the solemnity of that particular worship item. They should not enter into thy congregation. All her people sigh, and they seek bread. Well, they didn't have any bread. They have given their pleasant things for meat. How much do you think a loaf of bread would be worth if there was only enough bread for a tenth of the population? Probably trade your house for a loaf of bread, right? See, that was the situation. They've given their pleasant things for meat, food, to relieve the soul, to relieve hunger. See, O Lord, and consider, for I have become vile. The population became vile. The city became vile. And then in verse 12 there, this is kind of a distressing statement for Jeremiah to make. Is it nothing to you, all ye that pass by? Were there anybody passing by going to bring a truckload of goods into them? Would Moab and Edom and those Ammon and those surrounding nations, would they be trucking water and food and so forth to them? No. Is it nothing to you, all ye that pass by? This means nothing to those folks on the outside. Behold and see if there be any sorrow like unto my sorrow. Jeremiah's sorrow was more deep, no doubt, than his companions, and especially those that had no skin in the game, we might say. which is done unto me, wherewith the Lord hath afflicted. Jeremiah knew that this was God's affliction. He knew that because he preached that. He prophesied that God is going to afflict Jerusalem in the day of his fierce anger. Verse 13, from above hath he sent fire unto my bones. Heavenly fire, you might say. Kind of like it gives you the image of what? What other cities? Sodom and Gomorrah. And their fires came down. And it prevailed against them. For he hath spread a net for my feet. Spread a net for my feet. What's a net do? Catches an animal. So the folks there were trapped like animals in a trap. He hath turned me back. He hath made me desolate and faint all day, being downhearted and just in constant state of distress. The yoke of my transgression is bound by his hand. Now that yoke of transgression, what was the cause here of this distress? Was that the yoke of transgression. They are wreaked and come up upon my neck. They are wreathed and come upon my neck. For he hath made my strength to fall. The Lord hath delivered me into their hands, from whom I am not able to rise up. No relief, nobody to come to rescue. The Lord hath trodden under foot all my mighty men. The protectors, the army, the folks that were to protect them against the Babylonian assault. Those mighty men, those fighting men. He hath. They were trodden underfoot, so to speak. He hath called an assembly against me to crush my young men. The Lord has trodden the virgin, the daughter of Judah, as a winepress. Now that, I don't know much about wine presses, but that grape juice comes out, and there's kind of the image there of, you can imagine the streets of Jerusalem during that assault would have been running, filled with blood. And those that were killed in the battle, you see, that graphic way of saying, there's a bloody mess there. Verse 16, for these things I weep. So, the weeping prophet. Mine eye runneth down with water, because the comforter that should relieve my soul is far from me. My children are desolate, because the enemy prevailed. Again, further description of the situation in Jerusalem. Zion spreadeth forth her hands. It was as if, I give up. Spreadeth forth her hands. No protection. And there is none to comfort her. The Lord hath commanded concerning Jacob that his adversaries should be round about him. Jacob here being the description of Jerusalem here. And of course, the army of the Babylonians had been around about him, caged him in like an animal. Jerusalem is as a menstruant woman among them. That is pretty graphic language there that relates to being unclean, in the law of Moses, and hence circling back to this idea that Jerusalem was unclean, Jerusalem was revealed for its evil, and that was the reason for this destruction. Verse 18 is where we'll begin the next time. Verse 18.